Hi YouTube, it's Kathy and this is my weekly entertainment wrap-up for August 9th through 15th. This week I read 2 books, I watched 1 show, I watched 1 movie, and I listened to 3 books. First this week, because it's on a page-bound quest, I read a children's classic at this point, and that's Into the Wild, which is the first of the Warriors books. This is a series that I did not read as a child, and is definitely intended for a middle grade audience, which means I was incredibly surprised when the prologue had several different characters named and different attributes because they're all cats, so you're trying to remember who's what type of cat and also which cat is on which side and hates each other and why. However, after the prologue you start following this house cat who turns into a warrior, and since he's primarily interacting with people from one of the clan, because there's 4 different clans of cats, it's a little bit easier to follow who's who and who hates who and why. For me, this was just okay. This is just not something that is really my jam. There's a lot of political machinations, but that being said, I can understand if that is your jam, how kids would have really loved this series. I'm personally not going to continue, but that's because I read this specifically for a prompt on Pagebound for one of the quests. Actually, I think it's in at least 2 of the quests. Might even be 3 of the quests. But I do admit it keeps you hanging at the end because there's definitely something that should be communicated and hasn't been quite communicated, and somebody who's definitely on the evil side is being like, hey, don't you dare tell our boss this thing, and I'm like, I could see why you would want to read the next book in the series. The other physical book I finished this week is a graphic novel called This Place Kills Me. This one is following a character. I think this is meant to be set in the 90s, and she has been sent to this all-girls school because of something that happened back home. You don't know about that until further into the graphic novel. And as we meet her, the theater society of the school has just put on Romeo and Juliet, so there's lots of allusions to that. However, the next morning one of the students turns up dead, and we now need to figure out why. This was compelling enough that I read it in one sitting. I wanted to know what was going to happen. I wanted to know who was the bad guy. I wanted to know all of the reasons why this happened and also all of the reasons why all of the other students seem to be avoiding our main character. Did I see some of the twists coming? Yes, but I still enjoyed this. As for the show I watched this week, that was every single episode of a 2-season show called Traces. Or I guess I should say a 2-series show because the show is from the UK. At the beginning of this show we have this character named Emma who was born in Dundee but was raised somewhere else because her mother was actually murdered in Dundee when she was quite young and she hasn't been back since that time. However, she's now going to be working in this forensic institute that's highly praised in the area, and when she gets there she is immediately reminded of her mother's case because of something to do with this new product that's being launched, which is basically an online casework of how to solve a murder. From there, she gets incredibly invested in opening her mother's cold case and figuring out who killed her mom. When you get into the second series, that situation definitely comes to a head and certain things happen, and then that character kind of fades out and the other characters that were already at the institute kind of take over with another case. And this actually happens at the same time. So this case is happening and then this case starts, this case keeps going and finishes, but this case keeps going after that, if that makes any sense. It has been a few years since a series of this came out. I assume they're completely done doing it, and I'm okay with that only because there was something introduced in the second series where I was just like, okay, yeah, these characters had chemistry before, but that's before you told the audience that both of them are married to other people, and I'm no longer invested in them getting together, so I didn't really care for that, and that became a whole big plot point, and I didn't care. It got to the point where one would be on the phone to the other talking about actual casework, and they'd be like, I have something to show you, and I'm like, it better not be your tits. And I said this a few times before they finally got around to doing the deed, but I didn't want them to do it at all because they were both married to other people. Look, I get it, it happens, but I don't need it in a show like this. Speaking of crime, let's switch over into true crime and trying to figure out all of the stories behind that, because I watched most of a documentary called My Grandfather, Charles Manson. I say most of because I was watching this over at a friend's house and people came home when we still had about 20 minutes to go, so I haven't actually seen the end of this. But I can tell you the premise, which is this woman Sophie is living in Los Angeles, working paycheck to paycheck, trying to do the acting thing, also trying to do filmmaking, all of those types of things. So she co-directed this when she found out that her grandfather was Charles Manson. It turns out her dad for many, many years had been asking his mom if the dad he grew up with was actually his father biologically, and she eventually told him when he was 21 that he wasn't, but wouldn't tell him who the father was. So eventually he got DNA testing, found a half-brother, and then asked, hey, do you know who our dad is? And the guy's like, Yeah, unfortunately I do. Since Sophie has always been this kind person that wants to help people, she's been grappling with the fact that her blood literally is the same blood as Charles Manson's blood. So she's trying to figure out what his life was like and how there's parallels between her father's life and her grandfather's life. It was compelling and interesting, just incredibly dark at points before we even got to the whole cult of Manson thing. Also, this included some people that knew Manson back in the day, including some of his family, so that was interesting to see. Because this isn't a case that I know overly well. I've definitely seen videos about it before. You say Charles Manson or the Manson murders and I know what case you're talking about. So overall I found it interesting. Like I said, I didn't see it all the way to the end though, so if there's anything particularly weird that happens then, I can't tell you about it. As for the audiobooks I listened to, the first one was The Everlasting, because my friend Rachel over at Reads with Rachel is obsessed with this book and I figured it was about time. Also, I've been on hold for the audiobook for multiple months, so it was time. I didn't know anything about this going into it. I just knew that Rachel absolutely loved it, so I was like, okay, I'm not going to listen to anything about what this is about. I just want to go in and not know anything. And this starts off with a character named Owen Mallory. He's an academic in the field of history, and as we meet him, this book has just been delivered to him by mail. As he starts to translate it, he realizes that it is a first-person account of this figure from 1,000 years ago that has been cropping up in his life over and over and over again, until one day he comes back to his apartment and this book has disappeared along with all of his notes, and there's just an address he needs to go to. Selfishly, I kind of don't want you to know any more than that, because I didn't expect this next little bit that I will tell you a little bit about to happen, and it was absolutely fantastic. So if you don't want to know anything, just skip over to the next book right now. However, if you're cool with learning a little bit more about this book, but not all of the spoilers, what happens is he ends up having to go back in time and then actually write this first-person account of Una the Everlasting. Una is this knight who works for this queen and goes on all these amazing quests. And her story is really important to Dominion, which is where Owen lives, but 1,000 years in the future. And all I will say is the time travel does not stop here. This book is incredibly complex and interesting, and it gets very romantic at points. It gets to a point where you're very much rooting for these characters, and I absolutely fell in love with it. The second audiobook I finished this week is Woodworking. This primarily has two point-of-view characters that we hear chapters from. One of them is Abigail. She's a 17-year-old trans girl who had to escape her parents because they still think that they have another son. They've got other children as well, but she is known for a very long time that she is not a son, and she is now living with her older sister in a different town and going to school. The first character that we get introduced to, however, is Erica. She is a teacher at that school, and she is coming to the point to realize that she also is a trans woman. It's something she's simultaneously always kind of known, and she's kind of had inklings about in the past, but she's ignored those inklings to just go with the flow of what everybody else thinks she is. However, you might be wondering about the title of this book, and it's actually explained, I think, in one of Abigail's very first chapters, where she's talking about this concept of woodworking, which is trans people leaving where they grew up from, going to a different place, not letting anybody know that they're trans, and just kind of blending into the woodworking. That's another way of saying stealth, which is a term that I had heard before. As we go back and forth between these two characters, we have them not having exactly a friendship, because Abigail's like, no, I don't want to have a friendship with a teacher, that's weird, but also I guess I'm your trans mom. Them going to support groups on the down low because nobody knows about Erica yet. And then Abigail is also seeing somebody at school, but he doesn't seem to want everybody to know that they're dating, and she comes to a point where she's just like, I want us to be open about this situation because I don't want your stupid buddies laughing about me behind your back. Erica is also co-directing a production of Our Town with Brooke, who is Caleb's mother, and she is the campaign manager for this guy that basically thought the trans bathroom bills were a good idea. This is set in 2016, by the way, leading up to the election. So there is a lot that goes into this. There's a lot of secrets that are revealed. There's a lot of messy circumstances between different characters, and I absolutely adored it. Now, I finished this book yesterday, so you might be wondering to yourself, how did you read a whole entire other audiobook? Because you have 3 audiobooks to talk about and you finished this one yesterday. Did you read an entire other audiobook yesterday? And the answer to that is yes, because yesterday I went on a 35-kilometer walk, so that was basically an 8-hour day of just walking, so I needed a second book to get me through that. And that book was The Lion Women of Tehran. This book is about 2 characters growing up as best friends in Iran, but as we meet Ellie, the main character of this, she's actually living in New York with her husband. Basically, we learn a little little bit about the job that she's doing in New York, and then she gets this letter from home and she realizes it's from this woman that she hasn't talked to in years. And then we kind of turn back the calendar to the 1950s when they first met. This talks a lot about inequity in social status. This talks a lot about her relationship with her mother, who definitely had some views. This actually talks about her friend whose father has been jailed because he's a communist and she has similar views. This talks about friendship and misunderstanding and wanting to be certain things and then throwing away those certain things when your life changes. And I'm not going to be able to do it justice because there is so much that happens in this book. And a lot of it has to do with the political dissonance of this time frame, because this goes throughout decades. We start around 1955, I think it was, and we see these girls into the 60s, and then we see these girls into the 70s, and then I think the majority of the narrative finishes in the mid-1980s, but then there's an epilogue in 2022. Did I almost cry on the trail while listening to that? Yes, I definitely almost did, and it had nothing to do with the fact that my hips were incredibly sore, and it's not because I have a blister forming on the bottom of one of my feet. That's it for this week. If you've read, watched, or listened to any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you happen to be on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that, as always, is down below. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!